I thought I'd found the perfect part-time job. After scrolling through dozens of Craigslist postings in Riverside, California, one listing caught my attention. Experienced barista wanted flexible hours, great pay $25 per hour. The post was simple, professional, and the pay was almost too good to be true for coffee shop work in March 2023. The woman who responded to my inquiry introduced herself as Margaret Chen, a 58-year-old entrepreneur who'd recently opened a small specialty coffee shop called Morning Blend on Cedar Lane. She explained that she needed someone with barista experience to help during the morning rush and train her on the equipment she'd purchased. Having worked at Starbucks for 3 years during college, I felt confident I could handle whatever espresso machine she'd bought. Margaret suggested we meet at her shop for an interview on a rainy Thursday morning. She gave me an address on Cedar Lane, mentioning it was in a converted house with limited parking. When I arrived in my 2019 Honda Civic, I noticed the neighborhood was mostly residential with a few small businesses scattered throughout. The building looked like a typical craftsman-style home with large windows and a wraparound porch. Margaret greeted me at the door, a well-dressed woman with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a burgundy cardigan and had the kind of nervous energy you'd expect from someone new to the restaurant business. "David, thank you so much for coming," she said, shaking my hand firmly. "Please come in and let me show you around." The interior had been partially converted into what looked like it could become a coffee shop. There was a commercial espresso machine still in its packaging, bags of coffee beans stacked on folding tables, and several cafe tables arranged near the windows. Everything looked legitimate, if not quite ready for customers. "I'm still getting everything set up," Margaret explained, gesturing toward the equipment. "The health department inspection is next week, and I'm hoping to open by the end of the month. That's why I need someone experienced to help me understand this equipment and get the processes down." She led me to the espresso machine, a high-end Italian model that would have cost at least $15,000. "I've never operated anything like this," she admitted. "The previous owner of my building used to run a small cafe, and I bought this machine from him. I'm hoping you can teach me the basics while helping me prepare for opening." The interview went well. Margaret asked about my experience, my availability, and seemed genuinely interested in my suggestions for menu items and workflow. She explained that she needed me for about 20 hours a week initially, mostly mornings, and that once the shop opened, we'd discuss expanding my hours based on customer volume. "I'd like to start you immediately," she said as we wrapped up. "Would you be available tomorrow morning? I'm expecting a delivery of additional supplies, and I'd love to have you here to help me organize everything and start learning the equipment." I agreed, excited about the opportunity. The pay was excellent, Margaret seemed nice enough, and the idea of helping someone start their dream business appealed to me. She asked me to arrive at 7 a.m. the next morning and to bring any barista tools I might have, along with my social security card and driver's license for the employment paperwork. The next morning, I arrived promptly at 7 a.m. to find Margaret's silver 2020 Toyota Camry already parked outside. She met me at the door with coffee and pastries from what she said was the competition, a nearby Dunkin' Donuts. "I thought we should start with some caffeine." She laughed, seeming more relaxed than the day before. We spent the first hour unpacking the espresso machine and reading through the manual. Margaret was attentive, taking notes and asking detailed questions about everything from grind size to milk steaming techniques. She seemed genuinely eager to learn, though I noticed she kept checking her phone every few minutes. Around 9 a.m., she suggested we take a break. "David, before we continue, I need to handle some paperwork. Could you fill out these employment forms?" She handed me a clipboard with what looked like standard W-4 forms and an employment application that asked for my full name, address, phone number, emergency contact, and social security number. While I filled out the paperwork, Margaret stepped into what appeared to be a back office. I could hear her on the phone, though I couldn't make out the conversation. When she returned, she seemed different and more businesslike, less of the nervous energy from before. "David, I need to ask you something," she said, sitting across from me at one of the cafe tables. "Before we make this official, I want to make sure you're committed to this position. I've had problems with employees in the past who took advantage of my trust. She pulled out her phone and showed me what looked like a background check website. I hope you don't mind, but I like to verify that my employees are who they say they are. With all your personal information, I can run a quick check to make sure everything is legitimate. It's just good business practice. Something about the way she said it made me uncomfortable, but background checks weren't unusual for employment. I nodded, though I mentioned that most employers use professional services rather than handling it themselves. Oh, I prefer to do things personally, Margaret replied. I've found that people are more honest when they know their employer takes security seriously. She spent several minutes typing information into her phone while I waited. During this time, I noticed that despite her claims about preparing to open, there were no point-of-sale systems, no menu boards, no business licenses displayed, and no other signs that this was actually a functioning business in development. David, Margaret said finally, looking up from her phone with a strange smile. I've found some interesting information about you. Did you know that your credit report shows you defaulted on a student loan payment last year? And it looks like you had some trouble with a previous employer regarding a missing deposit? My stomach dropped. The student loan issue was a bureaucratic mistake that had been resolved, and I had no idea what she was talking about regarding any missing deposit. I think there might be some confusion. I started to say. Oh, I don't think there's any confusion, Margaret interrupted. I also found your social media profiles. Some of those party photos from college are quite interesting. I wonder what your current employer would think about some of those posts. She turned her phone toward me, showing Facebook photos from 3 years ago that I'd forgotten I'd even posted. They were typical college party pictures, nothing illegal or particularly embarrassing, but taken out of context, they could look unprofessional. Margaret, I'm not sure what you're getting at, I said, standing up. If there's a problem with my background check, maybe we should reschedule this. Sit down, David. Her voice had changed completely. Gone was the nervous, eager entrepreneur. This woman was cold, calculating, and completely in control. We need to discuss your new job responsibilities. She explained that the coffee shop was never going to open. She'd been running employment scams for over 2 years, collecting personal information from job applicants and using it to run credit checks, access social media accounts, and gather ammunition for what she called insurance policies. You see, David, I've learned that people will do almost anything to protect their reputation and financial security, she said. That student loan default, even though you claim it was a mistake, is on your credit report. Those party photos, while harmless, could be misinterpreted by the right people. And with your social security number and personal information, I can access quite a bit more about your life. She wanted me to continue coming to the fake coffee shop 3 times a week, where I would help her with what she called administrative tasks, essentially helping her organize information on other job applicants and potential victims. In exchange, she would pay me $200 per week and wouldn't share my personal information with anyone. If you decide not to participate, she said matter-of-factly, I'll be forced to contact your current employer about the discrepancies in your background. I'll also need to share those photos with your family members. I found your mother's Facebook profile quite easily. And unfortunately, identity theft is so common these days. It would be terrible if someone used your information to open credit accounts or commit fraud. I realized I was trapped in something much worse than a fake job posting. This woman had been running a sophisticated operation, using employment scams to gather personal information and create leverage over victims. The elaborate setup, the expensive equipment, the professional presentation, it was all designed to make people comfortable enough to hand over their most sensitive information. The most terrifying part was how normal it had all seemed. Margaret looked like someone's grandmother, the job posting was well written and professional, and the interview process felt completely legitimate. She'd created a perfect trap that could fool anyone looking for employment. I left that morning without agreeing to anything, but I knew the damage was done. She had my social security number, my address, my emergency contact information, and photos of my credit report and social media accounts. Over the next several days, I waited for the other shoe to drop. What I didn't know was that Margaret Chin had been perfecting this system for years, and my case was just one of dozens she was managing simultaneously. The real horror wasn't just what she'd done to me, it was what I was about to discover about the network of people she'd been controlling and the lengths she was willing to go to maintain that control. But that's a story that connects to something much bigger than just a fake coffee shop on Cedar Lane. What happened next would reveal the true scope of Margaret's operation and put me in contact with other victims who'd been trapped in her web for months. Have you ever responded to a Craigslist job posting that seemed too good to be true? What red flags do you think job seekers should watch for when meeting potential employers? The comments section is always interesting when people share their own employment horror stories. 3 weeks after my encounter with Margaret Chin, I was still dealing with the aftermath of her fake coffee shop scam. I'd frozen my credit, changed my passwords, and was constantly looking over my shoulder. What I didn't realize was that Margaret's operation was much larger than I'd imagined, and her victims weren't just job seekers, she was also targeting people who posted jobs on Craigslist, looking for employees they could exploit in different ways. This is where I met Detective Sarah Martinez from the Stockton Police Department's Cybercrime Unit. She contacted me in early April 2023 after I filed a report about Margaret's identity theft scheme. During our interview, she mentioned they were investigating several connected cases involving Craigslist employment fraud, including one that had escalated into stalking and harassment. "We've been tracking a pattern," Detective Martinez explained as we sat in her office on a rainy Tuesday morning. "Someone's been using fake identities to apply for security positions, then using those jobs to gather intelligence on homeowners and business owners. Your case with Margaret Chin might be connected to something we're calling the Guardian Angel investigation." She told me about Thomas Riley, a 34-year-old man who'd been responding to Craigslist ads for security guards and private protection services throughout the Central Valley. Unlike Margaret's fake job postings, Thomas was responding to legitimate ads from real people who needed security services. But instead of providing protection, he was using these positions to study his clients, learn their routines, and in some cases, escalate to full-scale stalking. The case that brought Thomas to police attention started with Janet Wilson, a 42-year-old real estate agent from Modesto who posted on Craigslist in February 2023, looking for a security guard for her upscale home. Janet had been receiving threatening messages from a former client whose offer on a house had fallen through, and she wanted someone to monitor her property during evening hours when she was alone. Thomas responded to her posting with impressive credentials. He claimed to have military experience, private security training, and excellent references from previous clients. His email was professional, his rates were reasonable, and he offered to provide a comprehensive security assessment of her property as part of his services. "I was desperate," Janet told Detective Martinez during her interview. "The threatening messages were escalating, and I'd seen strange cars parked outside my house. When Thomas offered to start immediately and his background seemed solid, I felt relieved that I'd found someone professional to help." Thomas arrived at Janet's house on Elm Drive driving a black 2018 Ford Explorer that looked like an unmarked security vehicle. He was well-dressed, articulate, and carried what appeared to be professional security equipment: cameras, radios, and a detailed incident report folder. During their initial meeting, he walked through her property, identified potential security vulnerabilities, and created what seemed like a comprehensive protection plan. He knew exactly what questions to ask, Janet recalled. He wanted to know my daily routine, where I worked, what time I came home, whether I lived alone, who had keys to the house. At the time, it all seemed like legitimate security planning. Thomas's contract was for evening security coverage, 6 p.m. to midnight, Monday through Friday. He would monitor the property, conduct perimeter checks, and maintain a log of any suspicious activity. Janet felt safer knowing someone was watching her house during the hours when the threatening incidents had typically occurred. For the first week, everything seemed normal. Thomas arrived promptly at 6 p.m., parked his Explorer in Janet's driveway, and conducted regular security rounds. He submitted detailed reports each morning, documenting weather conditions, neighbor activity, and any unusual occurrences. Janet appreciated his thoroughness and professionalism. But Thomas was doing much more than providing security services. He was using his position to study Janet's life in ways that went far beyond legitimate protection protocols. He photographed her mail, noted the names of visitors, researched her social media accounts, and began tracking her movements outside of his contracted hours. He installed a small camera in my mailbox during his second week, Janet discovered later. He told me it was for security purposes, to monitor anyone approaching the house. I thought it was a good idea. I had no idea he was using it to photograph my personal mail and learn about my financial accounts, medical appointments, and personal relationships. Thomas's behavior began escalating in his third week. He started showing up early for his shifts, sometimes arriving at 4 p.m. and parking down the street to observe Janet's routine. He began asking increasingly personal questions about her relationships, her finances, and her family members. When Janet mentioned feeling uncomfortable with some of his questions, Thomas explained that comprehensive security required understanding potential threats to all aspects of her life. The situation became more concerning when Janet's neighbors began reporting a black Ford Explorer parked in various locations around the neighborhood during daytime hours when Thomas wasn't supposed to be working. Mrs. Henderson, who lived across the street, mentioned seeing the same vehicle parked outside the grocery store where Janet shopped, and Mr. Patterson reported seeing it at the gym where Janet had a membership. I started feeling like I was being watched constantly, Janet told police. I'd see his vehicle everywhere I went, the bank, the restaurant where I met clients, even outside my mother's house across town. When I confronted him about it, he said he was conducting extended security assessments to better protect me. Thomas's explanation was that comprehensive personal protection required understanding his client's complete routine and identifying potential vulnerabilities in all locations she frequented. He claimed he was being proactive by studying her patterns and the security risks associated with each place she visited. But Thomas's real motivation became clear when Janet discovered he'd been using information gathered during his security assessments for far more invasive purposes. He'd learned her banking schedule and was photographing her interactions with bank employees. He'd identified her regular restaurant and was recording her conversations with clients and friends. He'd even followed her to medical appointments and was attempting to gather information about her health records. He knew things about my life that I'd never told him, Janet realized. He knew my doctor's name, my bank account numbers from photographing my statements, the names of my clients, and personal details about my family members. It wasn't security work, he was stalking me under the cover of protecting me. The breaking point came when Janet found Thomas inside her house during his shift, going through her personal files in her home office. When she confronted him, he claimed he was conducting a security assessment of her important documents to determine what a potential intruder might target. But Janet had installed her own security camera in the office after becoming suspicious, and the footage showed Thomas photographing her tax returns, insurance policies, and personal correspondence. Janet fired Thomas immediately and demanded he return all security equipment and any information he'd gathered. Thomas became hostile, insisting that their security contract required a 2-week notice period and that abruptly terminating his services would leave her vulnerable to the original threats she'd hired him to address. He tried to make me feel like I needed him, Janet explained. He said the threatening messages would resume if I didn't have professional protection, and that he was the only one who understood the scope of the security risks I faced. After Janet terminated Thomas's contract, the stalking behavior escalated dramatically. He began following her more frequently, showing up at locations where she was meeting clients, and attempting to contact her friends and family members under the pretense of conducting security follow-ups. Thomas called Janet's mother, claiming he was still providing security services and needed to verify information about family members who might be targeted. He contacted Janet's real estate office, identifying himself as her security consultant and requesting information about her schedule and client appointments. Most disturbingly, Thomas began using the personal information he'd gathered to create fake social media profiles that allowed him to monitor Janet's online activity and contact her friends and colleagues. He'd learned enough about her life to convincingly impersonate someone she might know professionally. He created a fake LinkedIn profile using information from my client files, Janet discovered. He was connecting with my business contacts and trying to gather information about my real estate transactions and personal relationships. When Janet reported Thomas to police, Detective Martinez discovered this wasn't his first case of using security work as a cover for stalking behavior. Thomas had responded to at least 12 other Craigslist security postings over the previous 8 months, using similar methods to gain access to clients' homes and personal information. We found evidence that Thomas was selling personal information gathered from his security clients, Detective Martinez explained. He wasn't just stalking individual victims, he was running a data collection operation using legitimate security jobs as cover. Thomas had been particularly targeting divorced women, elderly homeowners, and small business owners who posted security job listings on Craigslist. He presented himself as the solution to their safety concerns while actually creating additional security risks through his invasive surveillance and information theft. The investigation revealed that Thomas had detailed files on dozens of potential and former clients, including photographs of their homes, copies of personal documents, records of their daily routines, and information about their financial accounts and family members. He had created what amounted to stalking dossiers on every person who'd ever hired him for security work, Detective Martinez said. Some of these files contained hundreds of photographs and pages of personal information gathered through unauthorized surveillance. Thomas was arrested in May 2023 on charges including stalking, identity theft, burglary, and violation of privacy rights. Police seized his computers, cameras, and files containing information on dozens of victims who hadn't even realized they were being systematically monitored and exploited. But what made this case particularly disturbing was its connection to Margaret Chen's operation. During the investigation, police discovered that Thomas had been sharing information with a network of people running various Craigslist scams, including fake job postings designed to gather personal information. We realized that both Margaret and Thomas were part of a larger criminal network that was using different approaches to exploit people through Craigslist. Detective Martinez explained. Some were creating fake jobs to gather information from applicants. Others were responding to legitimate job postings to gain access to employers' homes and personal data. This revelation would lead to the discovery of additional victims and criminal operators, including someone who was using Craigslist to target people in ways that none of us could have imagined. What we thought were isolated incidents were actually part of a coordinated effort to exploit people's trust and vulnerability. The next phase of the investigation would reveal just how deep this network went and how many people had been affected by these connected scams. Have you ever hired someone through Craigslist for services in your home? What security measures do you think people should take when bringing strangers into their personal spaces? Looking back, what red flags do you think should have warned Janet that her security guard was actually the biggest threat to her safety? Detective Martinez's investigation into the Craigslist criminal network took an unexpected turn in late May 2023 when she received a call from Officer Kevin Brooks of the San Jose Police Department. What started as a routine report about suspicious activity in a Target parking lot would reveal the most sophisticated surveillance operation any of us had encountered. We had a citizen report someone tampering with vehicles in our Target lot on Meridian Avenue. Officer Brooks explained during a conference call with Detective Martinez and several other investigators. When we reviewed the security footage, we discovered something much more complex than simple vandalism. The case began with Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old software engineer who'd been browsing Craigslist's for sale section looking for vintage sneakers. Marcus collected rare Air Jordans and other limited edition athletic shoes, and Craigslist was often his best source for finding older models in good condition at reasonable prices. In early May, Marcus found what seemed like an incredible deal, a listing for vintage sneaker collection Jordan 1s, 3s, 4s, rare colorways moving sale. The photos showed dozens of pristine sneakers in their original boxes, including several models that typically sold for hundreds or thousands of dollars. The seller, who identified himself as David Kim, was asking for significantly less than market value and explained he was moving across the country and needed to sell everything quickly. The collection looked authentic, Marcus told police later. The photos showed proper box labels, correct manufacturing details, and the shoes appeared to be in excellent condition. David seemed knowledgeable about the sneakers when we exchanged messages, mentioning specific release dates and production numbers that only serious collectors would know. David's communication was professional and detailed. He provided close-up photos of specific shoes Marcus was interested in, answered technical questions about sizing and condition, and offered to meet in public locations for the transactions. He suggested they meet at various shopping centers throughout the South Bay, explaining that he was showing the collection to multiple potential buyers and wanted to coordinate meetings efficiently. Marcus's first purchase was a pair of 1994 Air Jordan 11s in the bread colorway, which David had listed for $800, significantly below the typical market price of $1,200 to $1,500 for that condition. They arranged to meet at the Eastridge Mall parking lot on a Thursday evening in early May. David arrived in a clean white 2020 Honda Accord, dressed professionally and carrying a large Nike duffel bag. He appeared to be in his early 30s, well-groomed, and spoke knowledgeably about sneaker collecting and authentication. The Air Jordan 11s were exactly as described: authentic, well-preserved, and priced fairly for a quick sale. He seemed like a legitimate collector who was genuinely moving and needed to liquidate his collection, Marcus recalled. We talked about other shoes in his collection, and he knew details about release dates, manufacturing variations, and collector value that convinced me he was serious about the hobby. During their transaction, David mentioned he had several other rare pairs that Marcus might be interested in, including some Air Jordan 4s from the late 1980s and early 1990s that were extremely difficult to find in good condition. He suggested they meet again the following week to look at additional shoes from his collection. Marcus was thrilled with his purchase and eager to see what other rarities David might have available. They arranged to meet the following Thursday at the Valley Fair Mall parking lot, where David would bring several pairs of Jordan 4s and some Nike Air Max models from the early 1990s. The second meeting went as smoothly as the first. David brought 6 pairs of vintage sneakers, all authentic and reasonably priced. Marcus purchased 2 pairs of Air Jordan 4s and agreed to meet again the following week to see more items from David's collection. During this transaction, David mentioned he was impressed with Marcus's knowledge of sneaker authentication and suggested they might be able to work out a bulk deal for some of the remaining shoes. What Marcus didn't realize was that David was using these transactions for purposes that had nothing to do with selling sneakers. During each meeting, while Marcus was examining the shoes and handling the transaction, David was discreetly placing small electronic devices on Marcus's car. The surveillance equipment was incredibly sophisticated, Officer Brooks explained. We're talking about GPS tracking devices smaller than a quarter, and audio recording equipment that could be magnetically attached to the underside of a vehicle in seconds. David had developed a system where he used the distraction of examining and authenticating sneakers to plant tracking and recording devices on buyers' vehicles. While Marcus was focused on inspecting the shoes, checking for manufacturing details, and completing the purchase, David would step around to different sides of Marcus's car, ostensibly to get better lighting or retrieve additional shoes from his bag, but actually attaching small electronic devices. The GPS trackers allowed David to monitor Marcus's daily routine: where he lived, where he worked, what routes he took, and what locations he visited regularly. The audio recording devices could pick up conversations that took place inside or near the vehicle, including phone calls made while driving, conversations with passengers, and discussions that occurred in parking lots or driveways. He was building comprehensive profiles of his buyers. Detective Martinez discovered during the investigation. He knew where they worked, where they lived, what their daily schedules looked like, and he was recording personal conversations to learn about their relationships, financial situations, and personal habits. After Marcus's third purchase from David, a rare pair of Air Jordan 3s and some vintage Nike Air Max shoes, he began noticing coincidences that made him uncomfortable. David seemed to know details about Marcus's life that hadn't come up in their conversations about sneakers. During their fourth meeting at the Santana Row shopping center, David casually mentioned that he'd seen Marcus's Toyota Prius at the gym on Meridian Avenue. When Marcus asked how he'd recognized the car, David explained that he'd been in the area and noticed the distinctive bumper stickers Marcus had on his vehicle. That seemed plausible at the time. Marcus told police, "I do have some unique stickers on my car, and it's possible he could have recognized it." But then he started mentioning other details that seemed like more than coincidence. David began referencing Marcus's work schedule, mentioning times when he'd be available to meet based on what he claimed to know about Marcus's typical routine. He suggested meeting locations that were convenient to places Marcus regularly visited, demonstrating knowledge of Marcus's habits that seemed to go beyond their brief interactions at sneaker transactions. Most concerning, David started making comments that suggested he'd overheard private conversations. He mentioned Marcus's girlfriend Sarah by name, despite Marcus never having discussed his relationship status during their meetings. He referenced a vacation Marcus was planning, including specific details about dates and destinations that Marcus had only discussed with close friends and family. I started feeling like he knew too much about my personal life, Marcus realized. When he mentioned that Sarah was worried about me spending too much money on sneakers, something I'd only discussed with her privately, I knew something wasn't right. Marcus became suspicious enough to examine his car carefully after his fourth meeting with David. During his inspection, he discovered a small magnetic device attached to the underside of his rear bumper. The device was about the size of a large coin and appeared to contain electronic components. Marcus immediately contacted police, who identified the device as a GPS tracking unit capable of transmitting location data to a remote monitoring system. A more thorough inspection of Marcus's vehicle revealed 2 additional devices, another GPS tracker and a small audio recording device that had been placed near the wheel well where it could pick up conversations inside the car. When we analyzed the devices, we discovered they were part of a sophisticated surveillance system. Officer Brooks explained. The GPS trackers were updating Marcus's location every few minutes, and the audio device had been recording continuously for nearly 3 weeks. Police used the electronic devices to trace David's surveillance network and discovered he'd been running this operation for over 8 months. He'd placed similar tracking and recording equipment on dozens of vehicles belonging to people who'd purchased items from his various Craigslist listings. David's scheme wasn't limited to sneakers. He was running multiple fake selling operations, vintage electronics, musical instruments, car parts, and collectible items, all designed to attract buyers who would meet him in person for transactions. Each category of merchandise was carefully chosen to appeal to hobbyists and collectors who would be likely to make multiple purchases and meet repeatedly. He was targeting people with disposable income who were passionate about their hobbies. Detective Martinez discovered. Sneaker collectors, vintage guitar enthusiasts, classic car owners, audiophiles, people who would be excited about finding rare items and wouldn't think twice about meeting the same seller multiple times. The investigation revealed that David had detailed surveillance files on over 60 victims throughout the Bay Area. He knew their home addresses, work locations, daily routines, family members, financial habits, and personal relationships. He'd been using this information to identify potential targets for burglary, identity theft, and other criminal activities. We found evidence that David was selling surveillance information to other criminals, Officer Brooks explained. He'd compiled profiles showing when people were typically away from home, what valuable items they owned, and what security measures they had in place. David's operation was particularly insidious because he used legitimate merchandise to build trust with his victims. The sneakers he sold were authentic, fairly priced, and exactly as described in his listings. Buyers had no reason to suspect they were being surveilled because they were getting good deals on genuine products from someone who appeared to be a knowledgeable collector. He invested significant money in acquiring authentic merchandise to make his operation credible, Detective Martinez noted. He was probably spending thousands of dollars on legitimate inventory to support a surveillance scheme that was generating much more through information theft and coordination with other criminals. The audio recordings David had collected were particularly invasive. He'd captured phone conversations about financial transactions, personal relationships, work situations, and family matters. Some recordings included people discussing passwords, bank account information, travel plans, and other sensitive details while driving alone or with family members. Police arrested David Kim, whose real name was Daniel Park, in June 2023 on charges including stalking, illegal surveillance, identity theft, and conspiracy. The investigation of his electronic equipment revealed connections to both Margaret Chen's fake employment operation and Thomas Riley's security guard stalking scheme. We discovered that Daniel was part of the same criminal network we'd been investigating, Detective Martinez explained. He was sharing surveillance information with Margaret and Thomas, and they were coordinating their activities to avoid targeting the same victims with multiple scams. The three criminals had developed a system where they shared information about potential targets and divided their criminal activities geographically and demographically. Margaret focused on job seekers and employment scams, Thomas targeted people looking for security services, and Daniel concentrated on collectors and hobbyists who would meet in person for transactions. They were running a comprehensive criminal operation that exploited people's trust in different ways, Detective Martinez realized. Someone could potentially be victimized by multiple members of this network without realizing the connections between different incidents. The discovery of Daniel's surveillance operation led to the identification of additional victims and revealed the scope of the network's criminal activities. But what investigators found next would show that these three criminals were just the tip of the iceberg, and that the network included someone whose activities were even more disturbing and far-reaching. The investigation was about to uncover the person who was coordinating all of these activities and using the information gathered by Margaret, Thomas, and Daniel for purposes that none of us could have anticipated. Have you ever purchased items from strangers through Craigslist or other online marketplaces? What precautions do you take when meeting people for transactions? Looking back, what warning signs do you think should have alerted Marcus that his sneaker purchases were part of something much more sinister? The breakthrough in Detective Martinez's investigation came from an unexpected source in July 2023. A college student named Jessica Parker contacted the San Jose Police Department about what she initially thought was a simple landlord-tenant dispute, but her call would expose the central hub of the entire Craigslist criminal network. Jessica was a 22-year-old psychology major at San Jose State University who needed affordable housing for the fall semester. Rising rent prices had forced her to look for creative housing solutions, and she'd been browsing Craigslist's rooms for rent section for several weeks when she found what seemed like an incredible opportunity. The listing was posted by someone named Patricia Williams, offering a fully furnished private room with its own bathroom in a quiet residential neighborhood near campus. The rent was $750 per month, significantly below market rate for the area, and Patricia explained that she was a retired teacher who preferred having responsible college students as tenants rather than maximizing rental income. The posting looked professional and legitimate, Jessica told Officer Brooks during her initial interview. Patricia included photos of a clean, well-maintained room with nice furniture, good lighting, and everything a student would need. She mentioned that she valued quiet, responsible tenants and was offering below-market rent because she wanted to help students focus on their education. Patricia's email responses were prompt, detailed, and reassuring. She asked appropriate questions about Jessica's study habits, class schedule, and lifestyle to ensure they'd be compatible housemates. She mentioned that she was home most days but kept to herself, and that she preferred tenants who were serious about their academics and wouldn't be hosting parties or bringing large groups of friends to the house. They arranged to meet at the property on Willow Court, a well-maintained single-story house in a quiet neighborhood about 10 minutes from campus. Patricia Williams appeared to be in her late 50s, neatly dressed, and spoke with the kind of authoritative but caring tone Jessica associated with experienced teachers. She seemed exactly like what I'd expected from her emails, Jessica recalled. She was professional, asked thoughtful questions about my major and career goals, and seemed genuinely interested in supporting students. The house was clean and quiet, and the room she was renting was perfect for studying. The bedroom was spacious and comfortable, with a double bed, large desk, good lighting, and plenty of storage space. The attached bathroom was clean and recently updated. Patricia explained that Jessica would have access to the kitchen and common areas, but that she typically kept different hours than her student tenants, and they probably wouldn't interact much on a daily basis. Patricia's lease agreement was straightforward: first month's rent plus a security deposit, standard terms about noise and guests, and expectations about keeping common areas clean. She didn't require extensive background checks or references, explaining that she trusted her instincts about people and preferred to keep the process simple for students. Jessica moved in during the first week of August, excited about having found such affordable housing so close to campus. The arrangement seemed perfect. She had privacy for studying, convenient access to school, and a landlord who was respectful of her space and schedule. For the first 2 weeks, everything went exactly as Patricia had described. Jessica rarely saw her landlord, who seemed to keep to different areas of the house and maintain the quiet environment she promised. The house was always clean, utilities worked properly, and Jessica felt comfortable and secure in her new living situation. But Jessica began noticing small details that seemed unusual, though not necessarily concerning. Patricia always seemed to know when Jessica was home or away, often mentioning in casual conversation that she'd heard Jessica return from class or leave for work. She also demonstrated knowledge of Jessica's schedule that seemed to go beyond what they'd discussed. She'd make comments like, "I noticed you were up late studying last night, or you must have had an early class this morning," Jessica remembered. At first, I thought she was just being observant about sounds in the house, but she seemed to know specific details about my activities that seemed like more than just hearing footsteps. Patricia also began making suggestions about Jessica's routine that seemed oddly specific. She'd mention that certain times would be better for doing laundry, or suggest that Jessica might want to study in her room rather than the living room during particular hours. Her suggestions always seemed helpful, but they were based on knowledge of Jessica's habits that felt more detailed than casual observation would explain. 3 weeks into her tenancy, Jessica discovered something that made her deeply uncomfortable. While reorganizing her closet, she noticed what appeared to be a small hole in the wall behind some hanging clothes. When she examined it more closely, she realized it looked like it had been deliberately drilled and was perfectly sized for a small camera lens. "I initially thought it might be some kind of old cable or utility connection," Jessica told police. "But when I looked at it carefully, I realized it was positioned at exactly the right height and angle to observe my bed and most of the room." Jessica used her phone's flashlight to examine the hole more carefully, and could see that it went completely through the wall into what should have been Patricia's part of the house. The hole was smooth and clean, clearly intentionally created, and appeared to have been recently made based on the lack of dust or aging around the edges. Disturbed by this discovery, Jessica began paying closer attention to other aspects of the house that had seemed normal before. She noticed that Patricia always seemed to know exactly when Jessica was in her room versus other parts of the house. She also realized that Patricia had made several comments about Jessica's study habits, sleep schedule, and daily routine that demonstrated unusually detailed knowledge. "I started testing whether she was actually watching me," Jessica explained. "I'd do things like pretend to leave for class but actually stay in my room quietly, or change my routine suddenly to see if Patricia would react. She consistently demonstrated knowledge of my activities that she couldn't have gained through normal landlord-tenant interaction." Jessica decided to investigate the hole in her wall more thoroughly. Using her phone's camera and flashlight, she discovered that the hole connected to what appeared to be a small space between the walls. When she listened carefully, she could hear faint electronic sounds humming and occasional clicking noises that suggested electronic equipment operating in the adjacent space. Growing increasingly concerned, Jessica began searching other areas of her room for additional surveillance equipment. She found what appeared to be a small camera lens concealed in the ceiling smoke detector, positioned to observe her bathroom. She also discovered that the electrical outlet near her desk had been modified in a way that suggested it might contain recording equipment. "I realized that my entire room was under surveillance," Jessica said. "Patricia wasn't just observing me casually, she had installed equipment to monitor everything I did in my supposed private space." Jessica contacted her parents and several friends about the situation, and they advised her to document everything and contact police immediately. But Jessica was concerned about confronting Patricia directly or having a dramatic scene that might escalate the situation before she could gather evidence and plan her response. Instead, Jessica decided to investigate further to understand the full scope of the surveillance before taking action. She used her phone to carefully photograph the holes, modified outlets, and other evidence of monitoring equipment. She also began paying attention to Patricia's behavior and comments to document the extent of her knowledge about Jessica's private activities. What Jessica discovered next was far more disturbing than she'd anticipated. While Patricia was away from the house one afternoon, Jessica carefully explored the areas adjacent to her room to understand how the surveillance system was configured. She found an access panel in the hallway that opened to reveal a narrow space between the walls that had been converted into a surveillance control room. The space contained multiple monitors, recording equipment, and what appeared to be a sophisticated system for monitoring not just Jessica's room, but multiple areas throughout the house. There were at least 6 different monitor screens showing live feeds from cameras throughout the house, Jessica discovered. "I could see my room from multiple angles, the bathroom, the kitchen, and even the front door area." Patricia had created a comprehensive surveillance system that monitored every part of the house where tenants might spend time. The surveillance room also contained files and documentation that suggested Jessica wasn't Patricia's first victim. There were folders labeled with what appeared to be names of previous tenants, containing photos, personal information, and detailed notes about their habits, schedules, and activities. Jessica found evidence that Patricia had been running this operation for at least 2 years, renting rooms to students and young professionals while secretly monitoring their every activity. The files contained intimate details about former tenants' personal lives, including information about their relationships, family communications, study habits, and financial situations. She had been systematically violating the privacy of dozens of people, Jessica realized. The files showed that she was recording personal phone calls, monitoring private activities, and documenting information about tenants' personal relationships and family situations. Most disturbing, Jessica discovered that Patricia was connected to the same criminal network that had been identified through Margaret Chen's employment scam, Thomas Riley's security guard stalking, and Daniel Park's sneaker surveillance operation. Patricia's surveillance files contained information that had clearly been shared with other members of the criminal network. She had detailed profiles of her tenants' daily routines, work schedules, financial information, and personal relationships that were being used by other criminals to target them for various scams and schemes. "We found evidence that Patricia was the coordinator of the entire operation," Detective Martinez explained after Jessica contacted police. "She was using her surveillance of tenants to identify potential victims for the other members of her network, and she was receiving information from their operations to enhance her own surveillance and manipulation of tenants." Jessica's discovery led to a coordinated investigation that revealed the full scope of the criminal network. Patricia had been renting rooms to carefully selected tenants, primarily students and young professionals with good credit, regular income, and limited local family connections, and using surveillance to gather comprehensive intelligence about their lives. She was specifically targeting people who would be ideal victims for various types of fraud and exploitation, Officer Brooks explained. Students with financial aid, young professionals starting their careers, people who were new to the area and didn't have strong local support networks. The surveillance equipment in Patricia's house was far more sophisticated than anything the other criminals had used. She had invested thousands of dollars in professional-grade cameras, recording equipment, and monitoring systems that allowed her to observe and record every aspect of her tenants' lives. She was recording everything: phone calls, video chats with family, private conversations with friends, intimate moments, Detective Martinez said. She had created detailed psychological profiles of her victims and was using that information to manipulate them and coordinate criminal activities against them. When police arrested Patricia Williams, whose real name was Patricia Chin, Margaret's older sister, they discovered that the surveillance house was the operational headquarters for the entire criminal network. She had been coordinating activities between Margaret's employment scams, Thomas's security stalking, Daniel's transaction surveillance, and several other criminals who were targeting Craigslist users. The four of them had created a comprehensive criminal enterprise that was exploiting people's trust in multiple ways. Detective Martinez explained. They were sharing information, coordinating their activities, and using surveillance technology to maximize their criminal effectiveness. Jessica's courage in investigating and reporting the surveillance operation led to the identification of over 100 victims across the Bay Area who had been targeted by various members of this criminal network. The investigation revealed that many people had been victimized by multiple members of the network without realizing the connections between different incidents. The case demonstrated how criminals were using technology and social engineering to exploit people's basic need for housing, employment, security, and consumer goods, turning normal Craigslist interactions into sophisticated surveillance and exploitation operations. But even with Patricia's arrest, investigators suspected that the network extended beyond these four criminals and that there might be additional victims and criminal operators who hadn't yet been identified. Have you ever rented a room or apartment through Craigslist or other online platforms? What privacy concerns do you think people should consider when living in shared housing situations? Looking back, what warning signs do you think should have alerted Jessica that her affordable housing situation was too good to be true? The final piece of Detective Martinez's investigation came from my own experience in late July 2023. After being contacted by police about Margaret Chen's fake coffee shop operation, I'd been following the case and trying to move on with my life. I thought the worst was behind me until I made what seemed like a routine purchase that would reveal the true scope of the criminal network I'd unknowingly stumbled into. I'd been looking for a decent set of golf clubs to take up the hobby during summer weekends. As a software developer working long hours, I wanted a relaxing outdoor activity that would get me away from screens and computers. After browsing Craigslist's sporting goods section for several weeks, I found a listing that caught my attention. Complete golf set to laced irons, driver, putter, great condition, $450. The posting was from someone named Robert Martinez who claimed he was selling his father's golf equipment after he'd passed away. The photos showed a high-quality set of laced irons, a tailor-made driver, an Odyssey putter, and a nice golf bag equipment that would typically cost over $1,200 new. Robert explained that his father had been an avid golfer, but the family wanted to sell his equipment rather than let it sit unused. "I've never used golf clubs and don't have any interest in learning," Robert wrote in his email. "My dad would have wanted these clubs to go to someone who would appreciate them and put them to good use. I'm pricing them to sell quickly because I'm moving out of state next month." Robert's communication was professional and seemed genuinely motivated by wanting to honor his father's memory rather than maximize profit. He provided detailed photos of each club, answered my questions about the equipment's condition, and offered to meet at a public location to complete the transaction. We arranged to meet on a Saturday afternoon at the Hillsdale Mall parking lot in San Mateo. Robert suggested meeting near the Macy's entrance, explaining that he'd be driving a blue 2017 Nissan Altima and would have the golf clubs in his trunk for me to examine before purchasing. I arrived at the meeting location in my Honda Civic around 2 p.m. and found Robert waiting near the designated area. He appeared to be in his early 40s, casually dressed, and had the golf equipment laid out next to his car for inspection. The clubs were exactly as described, well-maintained, high-quality equipment that was clearly worth significantly more than the asking price. "My father really took care of these clubs," Robert explained as I examined each piece. "He played twice a week for about 15 years and always cleaned them after every round. He was pretty particular about his equipment. The golf clubs were in excellent condition, the grips were still good, and the bag had minimal wear." Robert seemed knowledgeable about the equipment, mentioning specific details about the club's specifications and his father's playing preferences. Everything about the transaction felt legitimate and straightforward. I paid Robert the $450 in cash, and he helped me load the golf clubs into my trunk. We chatted briefly about golf courses in the area that would be good for beginners, and Robert mentioned a few places his father had recommended for people learning the game. The entire interaction felt normal and positive. "I hope you get a lot of enjoyment out of these clubs," Robert said as we concluded the transaction. "My dad always said golf was the perfect way to spend a Saturday afternoon, and I think he'd be happy knowing someone is going to use them properly." I thanked Robert and drove home, excited about trying out my new golf equipment. The clubs felt like a great deal, and Robert had seemed like a genuinely nice person who was handling a difficult family situation with grace. But as I drove home from the mall, I began noticing a blue Nissan Altima in my rearview mirror that looked identical to Robert's car. At first, I assumed it was coincidence the mall was a busy area, and it was reasonable that someone else might be heading in the same direction I was traveling. However, as I continued driving toward my apartment in Mountain View, the blue Altima remained consistently behind me through several turns and lane changes. When I deliberately took a longer route home to test whether the car was actually following me, the Altima maintained its position several car lengths behind me through multiple unnecessary detours. I started feeling genuinely concerned when the car followed me through a residential neighborhood that had no reason to be on anyone's normal route. I later told Detective Martinez. There was no logical reason for someone to make the same random turns I was making unless they were deliberately following me. I decided to test the situation more definitively by driving to a location I would never normally visit, a small shopping center about 10 minutes away from my intended route home. The blue Altima followed me into the parking lot, parked several spaces away, and remained there while I sat in my car trying to figure out what was happening. When I called my roommate to explain the situation, he suggested I drive to the nearest police station rather than going home. As I pulled out of the shopping center and headed toward the Mountain View Police Department, the blue Altima resumed following me, maintaining the same careful distance it had kept throughout the journey. At this point, I was convinced that Robert was following me for reasons that had nothing to do with golf clubs. I parked in the police station parking lot and waited to see what the blue Altima would do. The car slowed down as it passed the police station but continued driving rather than following me into the lot. I spoke with an officer at the Mountain View Police Department and explained the situation. While they took a report, they mentioned that following someone wasn't necessarily illegal unless it could be proven to be harassment or stalking. They suggested I document any future incidents and contact them immediately if the behavior continued. When I arrived home about an hour later, I was disturbed to find the same blue Altima parked across the street from my apartment complex. The car was positioned where the driver could observe the building entrance and parking area, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention from residents. I stayed inside my apartment and watched the car from my window. The Altima remained parked in the same location for approximately 2 hours before leaving. During this time, I photographed the car and license plate, though I couldn't clearly see the driver from my apartment window. The following morning, I discovered that someone had been examining my Honda Civic during the night. There were footprints around the car, the doors had been tested, though they remained locked, and it appeared that someone had looked under the vehicle and examined the trunk area where I'd placed the golf clubs. I realized that the golf club transaction had been some kind of setup. I told Detective Martinez when I contacted her about the incident. Robert had sold me legitimate equipment, but he was using the transaction to identify my vehicle, learn where I lived, and gain access to information about my daily routine. Detective Martinez immediately recognized the pattern from the other cases she'd been investigating. The golf club sale had the same characteristics as Daniel Park's sneaker surveillance operation, legitimate merchandise being used as cover for gathering information about buyers. When police investigated Robert Martinez, they discovered he was actually Roberto Vasquez, Patricia Chen's boyfriend and another member of the criminal network. Roberto had been running multiple sporting goods sales through Craigslist, using the transactions to identify potential victims and gather intelligence for the network's various criminal activities. Roberto was serving as a mobile surveillance coordinator, Detective Martinez explained. He would sell legitimate sporting goods to people who met the network's target profile, then follow them home to learn where they lived and gather information about their routines and security measures. The investigation revealed that Roberto had conducted similar operations with dozens of Craigslist buyers over the previous year. He sold golf clubs, tennis equipment, bicycles, and other sporting goods at below-market prices to attract buyers, then used the transactions to conduct surveillance and gather information for the criminal network. He was specifically targeting people who appeared to have disposable income and lived alone or in situations where they might be vulnerable to various types of fraud or exploitation, Detective Martinez said. The sporting goods sales were essentially reconnaissance missions disguised as legitimate transactions. Roberto's surveillance files, discovered when police searched Patricia's house, contained detailed information about dozens of Craigslist buyers. He had photographs of their homes, records of their daily schedules, information about their vehicles, and notes about their apparent financial situations and lifestyle patterns. We found that Roberto was sharing this surveillance information with all the other members of the network, Detective Martinez explained. Margaret would use it to create targeted employment scams, Thomas would use it to identify potential security clients, Daniel would use it to coordinate his transaction surveillance, and Patricia would use it to identify potential tenants for her surveillance house. The investigation revealed that I had been targeted by the criminal network from the beginning. Margaret's fake coffee shop had been specifically designed to target me based on surveillance information Roberto had gathered from a previous golf equipment purchase I had made 6 months earlier from a different member of their network. Your case helped us understand that this criminal organization had been operating for at least 2 years and had developed sophisticated methods for identifying, surveilling, and exploiting victims through multiple coordinated approaches, Detective Martinez explained. They were running a comprehensive criminal enterprise that used Craigslist as a platform for targeting people in various ways. The arrests of Margaret Chin, Thomas Riley, Daniel Park, Patricia Chin, and Roberto Vasquez led to the identification of over 200 victims who had been targeted by various aspects of their criminal network. Many victims had been exploited by multiple members of the network without realizing the connections between different incidents. The investigation revealed that the network had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars through identity theft, fraud, burglary, stalking, and information sales. They had used legitimate-seeming Craigslist transactions to create comprehensive surveillance operations that violated victims' privacy and security in ways that most people never could have imagined. This case demonstrated how criminals are adapting to use technology and social media platforms to create sophisticated exploitation schemes, Detective Martinez said. They were using people's trust in normal commercial transactions to gain access to their personal lives and create opportunities for multiple types of criminal activity. The prosecution of this criminal network led to significant prison sentences for all 5 members and resulted in new protocols for investigating Craigslist-related crimes. The case also highlighted the need for people to be more cautious about personal information security when conducting online transactions. For me personally, the experience fundamentally changed how I approach online transactions and personal security. I learned that criminals are willing to invest significant time and resources in legitimate-seeming operations to gain access to potential victims, and that seemingly innocent transactions can be part of much larger criminal schemes. The golf clubs I purchased from Roberto were eventually returned as evidence, and I never did take up golf as a hobby. The entire experience left me with a deeper appreciation for the importance of personal privacy and security, and a better understanding of how vulnerable we all are when we trust strangers in online transactions. The criminal network's operations affected hundreds of people who thought they were simply looking for jobs, security services, collectible items, housing, or sporting goods. Instead, they became victims of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that exploited their basic trust in human decency and normal commercial interactions. Have you ever purchased sporting goods or other expensive items through Craigslist? What precautions do you think people should take when meeting strangers for high-value transactions? Looking back, what warning signs do you think should have alerted buyers that these seemingly legitimate transactions were actually part of a criminal surveillance operation? The investigation into this criminal network demonstrated that our normal assumptions about online transactions and personal privacy may no longer be adequate protection against increasingly sophisticated criminal operations. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who seem the most normal and trustworthy. Thanks so much for watching. I can't express enough how much your support means. The likes, the comments, it all really helps the channel grow. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. I always take the time to read them. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on any new videos. See you next time.